take this time to welcome everyone who has joined us today for this third episode of Friendly Facetime. I think today I'm both excited as well as I was telling Amrita, I'm equally nervous as well to host the speaker we have for today. Someone who has interviewed Lady Gaga and has been a host and a speaker, I think more number of times than all of us put together. I think maybe welcoming Amrita Tripathi to the panel that we have today, where we'll probably have you on the other side of the table and ask you questions rather than you hosting as well. So maybe we'll try and see if we can match the bar that you have set already. And maybe as part of that, have a lot of learnings that could be shared with individuals who are here. Yeah, so welcome so much, Amrita.
Thank you. That's too kind. Also, it's I don't know which side we'll trade notes afterwards. Which is easier? Is it easier to ask the questions, or is it easier to be on the be on the spot? But I look forward to this. Thank you.
Definitely, I think so. I think maybe a little bit for people who may not know Amrita yet. I think, like I said, I think she has interviewed celebs as well. She has been a journalist for a very long time. Has been with Twitter as well on the content partnership side. And the most important thing, I think she's been a mental health advocate as well, running a firm called Mental Health Collective for more than 5 years. And she has written a lot of books around that. And we'll also share those links towards the end for people to read as well. And very recently, I think a lot of effort that Amrita has put in the past, and also through TapIn, which is her newest organization that she has formed in the beta phase, if I'm not wrong, Amrita, and we'll maybe touch upon that as well. But through, I think, all of that, you've done a lot of work towards the women upliftment side of it, training side of it, on the leadership side as well. So I think with all of that, I would want to welcome Amrita today. And maybe to start with, would want Amrita to tell us a little bit beyond these achievements and accolades while we will get there. But if you could just tell us who Amrita is as a person, a little bit about that behind this whole motivational speaker and the achievements that I spoke about.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much, Puneet. Thank you to your entire team. You really made my day by organizing this, and thanks everyone who's joining. I hope that we'll have a fulfilling chat. And Puneet and I have obviously discussed that it's not going to be gyan so much as a conversation. So one thing about getting to the stage I am, and I've started calling myself vintage, is that when you have about 20 years of work experience, which is I think what I get this year, a lot of it makes sense looking back, like the patterns make sense to you looking back. But my journey really started, when I was much younger. I've always been a reader. I was a bit of a nerd, and I always really, really wanted to be a writer. And when I was 15 years old, I wrote my autobiography. It was terrible. It was really the worst, worst thing you can imagine. But I had the sense that, I wanted to be a storyteller. I don't think we used to call it, narrative or storytelling back then, but I knew I wanted to be a writer when I was very young. And my parents reminded me much later that I had told them I wanted to be a journalist as well. I used to watch Christian Amanpour on CNN, and, that was really a dream of mine. I actually studied philosophy. And I think nobody would have thought that was a practical decision, but a very supportive family. And I became a journalist right after that. So I did my master's in philosophy, and then I joined the Indian Express, which is a newspaper I still love. I learned a lot in those 2 years. And then I moved to a channel that was launching called CNN IBN. It's now been rebranded, of course, but it was at CNN IBN, where I was for nearly a decade. So nine years and change, that I actually grew. I think that learning how to talk to people across the board, learning how to do interviews, learning how important stories can be and the impact they can have, especially when you're in the media. That was really something that hit home for me. And it was in that role, I had several roles there, including as an anchor. I got to interview all these fantastic celebrities, which was really fun. But I was also health editor there, Puneet. So I think, it was while I was leading a team dedicated to health. And this is back in the day when, H1N1 had first entered our vocabulary, swine flu had entered our vocabulary. We started realizing that mental health is very underserved. So, even as I, decided to leave and try out a few different things along the way, that was in the back of my mind, that, the way that we're telling stories about mental health in India is not helping. The message is not reaching. And this is something the experts used to keep telling me, that, you only do American case studies or British case studies. At that point, there was no Indian lens, So I think for me, if I look back, what connects everything is that interest in storytelling and that curiosity about people, people's stories. And that's kind of led me to where I am today.
Got it. Got it. I think curious to know, because you mentioned you wrote your autobiography at 15-year-old. Like, what was the title of that autobiography?
I think it was something like the life and times of Amrita and some horrible drawings. Now I'll find it for you. But it was,
Okay.
yeah, definitely no critical merit. But later I look back and I think, it's quite sweet, right? At that age when you think that you'll have enough to document, as if, that is enough of a chapter. But I think that was, it was an inkling, probably looking back, that, I would want to be a writer at some point.
All right. I think the reason I was asking you the autobiography title was when we actually spread awareness among corporates, colleges as well. We actually make them do an exercise where we make people imagine themselves 10, 15 years down the line and think of a title they would want their autobiography to have. And somewhere which helps us also think a little more in the future. That's the reason I was curious to know you did it in the past instead of.
That's really fascinating because, I think the other thing is it's really hard. I think now at this stage to think, maybe one of the flip side of meeting so many amazing people and hearing so many stories, it's hard to project yourself and think that, my story might be important, but I feel like it's true that everyone has some vision, right? Some purpose and some reason to tell that story for sure.
Right. So just curious to know, Amrita, like you said, definitely there were some gaps you identified in terms of mental health, but most of the work that you have done has been around mental health and women, as I think these are two important segments for you so far.
Yeah.
You have picked as well. Like, what were the reasons you picked these two and why are these so close to you? Are there certain triggers or was it just the gaps that you saw that made you take this up?
Sure. And that's such a good question. I'll take the mental health one first. I think that one was, as a professional, as a journalist, I noticed these gaps also because I was getting the opportunity to meet these psychologists and psychiatrists. So they were very clear that the media was not doing the best job. We tended to do stories essentially when there was something sensational happening. And they said that you have such a vehicle to provide mass awareness, right? There is so much power in what the media can do that really hit home. I set up the Health Collective initially just to share helplines. To be honest with you, I had seen somebody tweeting that a friend of theirs was very desperate and in need. And I saw that tweet two days later. So I messaged them. It wasn't even someone I knew. It was someone I knew on Twitter. I DM'd them to say, I'm sure you found someone by now. And I was pretty shocked that, this was back in 2016, that, even in urban privileged Mumbai, somebody doesn't know how to reach out for help. So I set up the site initially with helplines. And luckily, I had that network and the expertise from the journalism days. But very quickly, people started writing in to share their stories. I still remember the first 3 stories people wanted to share of their own lived experience. And that made me realize, look, we have something here. So we would go to experts for columns and advice, but the real experts are the people living with these conditions, right? So we started getting that kind of word of mouth interest and building out as a safe space. But all this to say, it took me several years before I realized personally why I was so interested. We have mental illness, in the family, extended family. And I think unlike a lot of parents, my parents were very open about talking to us when we were kids. So they didn't want us to be scared of someone who had schizophrenia. They didn't want us to be scared of people who are mentally ill. And when I was younger, we had this book called Young Mental Health. So when I was writing that book with my, so all of the books are co-authored with, psychologists or psychiatrists, of course. As I keep promising my mom, I tell people I'm not a therapist. I know I'm not a therapist, but my background is obviously as a journalist and writer. But when I was writing that young mental health book and talking to younger people, I did share for the first time that when I was younger, I did have a self-harm, like a phase of self-harm and disordered eating. And I never thought it was important to focus on until I started talking to younger people and realizing, if we had people who spoke openly back then, in sort of my vintage, it would have made our life so much easier, right? Because the biggest problem I see, and I wonder if you guys see this with your work you're doing, the biggest problem is that because we get scared or we're ashamed or that stigma is so real even today, we start feeling it's just me, I'm alone, nobody can reach me. And I think that's what's very detrimental, because apart from dealing with something, you then feel you're alone and isolated. And it doesn't matter if you're young or you're an adult. I think the more we can do to help the young, the better, because of course, as you know, there's a lot of preventive work in mental health, right? The more we can learn to articulate, share our stories, again, in a safe space, not just randomly to everybody, the more important that is. And to the second part, I think for me, I didn't really pick, I think, women's rights. It's always been interesting to me, but long ago, right after that, sort of terrible December 2012 gang rape in India, there was a group called Gender Log India, which I helped to co-curate, where we would bring different women to talk every week about gender from their lens. And I learned so much in that process. It's also in the corporate world. I would say after I left journalism and I started transitioning mid-career, that I realized that, you know what, like you need a lot more solidarity when you're a working woman. I think you need to build out that net. Nobody will tell you these things, right? And it's a different skill set than say when you're a journalist and you have a mic and you're going out and doing your stories. I think journalists are quite, there's a lot of camaraderie. It's a very close tribe. In the corporate world, you kind of are all fighting very similar battles, but you have to put so much more effort into building a network, making allies, you know, and these kind of things, which I think people don't really tell you point blank. So it just happened that I think and it's interesting because of my work in the mental health space, like for example, at Twitter, people would assume incorrectly or correctly, but they'd assume that, you know, I'll be open to having conversations, be a little bit more empathetic. And certainly I learned how do you listen, right? Learning to listen is such a difficult, I mean, again, no one teaches you that, right? Until you are in this space. So I started hearing more and more stories from women sharing similar challenges. So I think that's where the intersect happened. But I realized that, you know, there's something here which we might talk about TapIn, but both, I mean, I feel very, very passionately about for sure.
Okay. But do you see things changing, especially on the first part of mental health, like you said, do you see things changing post-COVID? Or like, how do you see the landscape in India, especially in terms of mental health growing and the path it still needs to take to be there?
Yeah. No, 100%. I think it's very easy to, especially in the field we are in, and I would love to hear from you and your team as well, because I think it's very easy when you start looking at the problem and the scale of the problem, it's very easy to lose track of how much progress we are making. I mean, the fact that we're even having a conversation like this and, 100 odd people joined in, or, hundreds more might watch it. The fact that we can talk about this in 2023, there's been a sea change for sure. I do think because of the pandemic, we started seeing more stories in the mainstream about mental health, certainly about anxiety. And it's so many people who have been working on this quietly for so long that helps. It's also that we stand on the shoulder of giants, right? Because I think if people were not willing to have these conversations, if that first generation of psychiatrists and psychologists had not come in and started bashing away, we had this really fascinating interview with Dr. Amit Sen. He's a very well-known child and adolescent psychiatrist, and he wrote the foreword for our book on young mental health. And I think he said this, and another psychiatrist told us this, that when they had chosen, so they've been working for 30 plus years, when they chose psychiatry back in the day, their peer group was saying, I don't know why. Why would you do this? There's no business model. What are you doing? And, I think that, those people had the vision and the interest and the skill set. So I think there has been a lot of progress in terms of conversations, in terms of access to resources. There's still a huge, of course, gap in terms of supply, in terms of affordability. One thing that I do feel strongly about is that I see a lot more young people opening up about mental health issues. I think still there are, of course, gaps, right? Like, so if I was saying 10 years ago, we didn't know what an India lens meant for mental health, or mental illness rather. We all have mental health. We didn't have necessarily the vocabulary in our local languages. We didn't think of mental health as an Indian problem. Even today, sometimes you'll get those comments, right? People will say this is a Western issue. It doesn't happen in India. All of these things like Yevo, which you think that more people need to fight the ignorance, right? It's not a question of one person being able to do it. We all have to be able to find how we can create some safe space, not just in forums like this, but also in our own families, with our own friends, right? In our real life, I would say. So I see progress, but I do think, there's a lot more to be done, because every time somebody discriminates against someone, or, every time there's no support in a job, even if the intentions are very good, but somebody feels unsafe talking about something like depression or something, that just shows you how far we still have to go. For us, we tell our contributors, the first book on depression, I think there were 9 or 10 stories in the first person. I think everyone except one person used their real name. And, I do tell my contributors, it's so brave of you to do this. And, they'll turn around and say, I'm waiting for the day it's not brave anymore in India. I'm waiting for the day when anyone can feel comfortable sharing their story, knowing that you won't judge us. Right. But till that day, they share their stories because, again, they hope that, if somebody had done that for them, they would have felt less alone, So I think things are changing. I'm curious to know, Puneet, how do you feel? Because you talk so much to corporates and to college kids with your team. Do you see a more open kind of attitude now?
Definitely. I think, like you said, see, we also started almost 8 years back now. And even before that, coincidentally, we also started as a blog writing stories. So Vijay and me, we met together in 2009.
Oh, wow.
Because of the personal situations that we both saw in our own colleges, we actually wanted to do something about this, and we started it as a blog because both of us don't come from this background.
Yeah.
Through blogs and writing stories about people, like you said, I think that made people connect to it. So I think because we did not belong to this background, we used to write it in very layman terms.
Yeah.
People used to connect it and then used to actually write a comment saying, I'm also going through a similar phase. Can I also connect to an expert? And that's when we thought, okay, let's go a step further and make that servicing side of it as well, where we can connect them to experts also available, because that's where the solution also lies further.
Yeah. Yeah.
And through that, I think journey of last 7-8 years, if you ask us, I think we used to ask this question, do you know a difference between psychologist and psychiatrist? That's the first video we had created in Yodos way back in 2015. And now if you ask, we don't need that video anymore, because at that point in time, it is a social experiment. We went across Bangalore in terms of, I would say, near Christ College. We also went near MG Road and all of it. And very, very few people actually knew that difference. Right? Whereas now, if we ask, I think there are more than 60 to 70% people are still aware of it. So definitely, I think through that anecdote as well, there is a path. And we also run an initiative called YD Warriors. So we call people who are open to share their names and stories after being helped as part of therapy to be able to share and inspire others to be more open and vocal. So I think we have seen that has been a lot more easier now in the last 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
Especially with pandemic, I think people have been able to look a lot more inwards, prioritize, and definitely social media has also helped in that by speaking about it. So I think we do, I think, see that change from our side.
And I think that's so important to reflect and absorb and think about, because like I said, the problem is so big that it's very easy to lose sight of that hope. It's very easy to say, oh my God. And I find that kind of prevents more people from doing things, because we do know India has so many macro problems that if you can sometimes just feel like, oh God, there's nothing I can do that can make a difference. But if you see that, maybe through the stories, 1, 10, 100,000 people have been impacted, that's an incredible. I feel like everyone has that 1 or 2 things they care about, and I do think it's important to hold on to that hope and tell people that things are changing, even as we work behind the scenes. I think that's important.
But like, maybe curious to know as well, like you have worked in Twitter for a good amount of time. So has that also made you understand the role media plays, especially social media, for example, which is, I think, the closest to the younger generation for influencing more than the parents or the peers. I think social media influences us more. Have you seen that journey as well and the role it has played?
Yeah. So, the Twitter journey has been interesting. So for those of you who I don't know, I was at Twitter India for about 5.5 years. And I think I was pretty lucky that I got to decide I was quitting in December. But as a lot of you have seen the headlines, and it's not been a great time for a lot of my friends and colleagues as well. I think that was a natural end of the journey for me. I was pretty interested to read studies about social media and anxiety, for example. So, we have this book called Age of Anxiety, where my co-author is Kamna Chibber, the psychologist. I didn't because of obviously the conflict, and I was working at Twitter, I would tell people, but I wouldn't necessarily focus on the research of like, what is Twitter doing versus Instagram versus some of the others. But what we were hearing from experts was certainly that there's a rise, for younger people, it is bullying. Unfortunately, there was bullying in every generation, but when you take it online, cyber bullying can be very, very it can feel very overwhelming and intimidating for kids. There's definitely an uptick in anxiety, the way we're spending time on social media. But I'll tell you the counter to that. And I think Twitter, we worked a lot with journalists. Like I was working with content partners in India. So journalists and then media organizations. And then I started working with sports partners and entertainment. And of course, that was less controversial, but there's also equally challenges for all of them, because I think there's so much pressure now. I think it wasn't the role at Twitter that helped, but my role at Twitter kind of coincides with the trajectory of social media in this country. And you see now there's so much pressure to perform, right? I think that takes a toll on people's mental health, whether we like it or not. What you were talking about is that now there's so many more stories on Instagram, which is true. But at the same time, some of the sources of these are not the most, I think there's so much pressure to also make content in a format that will go viral. So like, when you have these Insta influencers for mental health, we really need to be extra vigilant about who are we following, who are we taking advice from. If I have anxiety and, you're on Instagram telling me these are 3 things you can do to tackle your anxiety, and it works for you because that's what's worked for you, but it doesn't work for me. That's added pressure and stress for me, because there are no quick fixes to these, kind of disorders, as the therapists keep telling us, right? So I think there's a parallel to how much social media has helped, because certainly it has helped democratize, it has helped flatline hierarchies. We know during the pandemic, folks in the LGBTQ community felt less alone because they could go online. Some of them because, they were back home, and that was not a great situation sometimes for people. So we know that there are there are very many pros to social media. I think the cons we're hearing more and more about now. And the biggest thing I would say the takeaway was that we have to, as individual consumers, exert control. I need to have enough control to say, I'm not going to be scanning my phone first thing in the morning. I'm not going to be looking at Instagram or Twitter or whatever. So the more agency we take, the better for us. And I say, as an employee of Twitter India, I learned a lot from the way the company, Twitter 1.0 we call it now, the way the company cared about mental health and wellness, especially during the pandemic. We had a psychiatrist who was the head of wellness. She created a program, which I joined actually, where they would teach us mental health first aid, take volunteers from the team to become, we call them owls, but they were basically buddies. Like I will do a listening circle in APAC, somebody will do a listening circle somewhere else. And I learned that from the way Twitter operated as a company, that it makes such a huge difference when things are happening. Because something dramatic at the pandemic, people are feeling so disconnected. Just having a safe space for an internal conversation can be very powerful. So again, that's something that not many people know, because obviously it was an internal initiative. But it taught me a lot about how you can show up for each other in a workspace where you don't necessarily need to be talking about, mental illness, but everyday mental health concerns like stress, anxiety, things that happen. That was something we learned in that process.
Got it. And in terms of your journey so far, Amrita, like definitely you have worked in organizations as well as you're starting up on your own. You have also run Health Collective for quite some time, with a lot of work with women in terms of both rights as well as upliftment that you have been doing. Like, what are certain key themes you have identified as well, Amrita, which needs to be worked on or focused on? Because I think, especially March being Women's Day, this is something we started as a talk on Women's Day.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe if we could also touch upon a little bit on your observations there and things that people could take away from as well.
Yes, for sure. I think we have seen these studies and research that, women are disproportionately affected by certain kind of mental health issues. Like when you look at anxiety, you look at depression, at least according to the research, you tend to see more addiction and some of these other issues when it comes to men. But I don't think, there's no, I don't see any upside to comparing the genders when it comes to mental health, especially in a country like India, because we know that we're quite behind the baseline. We are still struggling to have conversations where, you can talk to your parents, you can talk to your friends, your uncle and aunts about mental health issues without feeling worried or without them panicking for you. Because I think the other thing is a lot of it is well-intentioned, but people get scared because they don't want, your reputation to get affected, or they don't want somebody else to judge you. And I think we all understand where that comes from, but that becomes very difficult, especially I think for women, when you're bearing the burden of so much other conditioning. So there are certainly things in this, especially for the tech sector, this is a really, really bad time because of layoffs. And we can see, there's been some speculation that it affects women more than men. We definitely know that, the unpaid labor falls mostly on women as caregivers and so on, and that leads to more stress, exhaustion, and burnout. But I think that if we're looking at what can help, like I think it's always helpful to see, one is, of course, listening, like who are the people who will listen to you empathetically. Active listening is something, you can learn. There are these mental health first aid courses if anyone is interested. And that is something that's very counterintuitive. So, sometimes if somebody is telling you something, a friend is telling you something about how bad things are, our natural reaction is usually to say, don't say that, look at how lucky you are, or, look at how well off you are, or look at how everyone loves you. And that is something that requires training for us to know that, if I say that, I'm invalidating, or I'm actually shutting down my friend, because my friend is not going to then come and tell me the next time when things are terrible. And so just learning the art of listening with empathy. There are so many professional women, I can't even tell you right now, who a couple of friends also have just said, somebody saying, can I make you a cup of tea? Can you imagine, like something so basic, which we take for granted, but doing that for a woman, doing that for someone in your house, telling somebody, I can see what you're going through. Do you want to just sit down and have a chat? Think about the young mothers, think about the people who are juggling, so many people are taking care of their aging parents. India still has that social fabric, but a lot of this is unseen labor. So one thing is to let people, like you were saying, when people share stories, they feel heard and seen. That becomes really important. For women, I will say with TapIn, I do plan to, with my co-founder, Preeta, we do plan to have a pillar around, I think I have to have a pillar around mental health. So, we're going to do something about resilience and avoiding burnout, where you're not looking at necessarily the individual, like we don't put the onus on the individual, but you are working in an environment right now where there are multiple layoffs, massive pressure. And I think everyone just presumes work stress is a part of your day-to-day life, right? So how do we work with the therapists and stuff to make sure that they get tips on managing that. We also have, along the lines of confidence building measures. So when I come to very common themes that have come up in conversations, or a survey we did with 100 women, people are constantly battling this imposter syndrome. So I guess that comes into mental health as well, right? So it's kind of figuring out things like, we're calling it the TapIn 5. So we'll share more with you guys when we're fully ready. But things like public speaking and presenting, owning your narrative, how do you go into a sales room with the same confidence that you go into your manager and say that you want a promotion? How do you do negotiation? I think these kind of things, but the mental health and the workplace aspect is really, really important, because I think, I don't think that many Indian companies talk about it, but I'll definitely pick your brain on that later. I think that we need to find ways to make these conversations maybe friendlier, so it's easier for people to have, rather than worrying about jargon and how technical things can get.
Got it. And is there something like, I think you touched upon TapIn, what you're trying to do through that, but like, is there a certain need you identified which you want to fulfill? And what is the approach at a very broader level for the audience to know, even if you are entering the beta phase now?
Yes.
But a little bit, if you could touch upon like how people could leverage that and what you're trying to do through that. That'll be
yes, for sure. So it's very early days. So we started with a survey to about 100 women. And, based on the fact that my co-founder and I both have about 20 years of work experience, with local teams, global teams, regional teams, we've realized that there are a few challenges that keep coming up for women, especially. So we're looking at women who have at least 5 to 8 years of work experience and tend to then hit a ceiling. This transition between being an individual contributor to being a manager, leading a team, learning how to negotiate, and sort of not falling off that cliff, because we've seen a lot of studies. McKinsey has one. There are Indian studies as well about women on that path to leadership who then drop out of the workforce, and we know that there are many reasons this happen. So we want to create this as a sort of membership network / upskilling opportunity. So we'll be looking at tapping in our networks, but also creating VOD modules. And what I loved from the initial survey was that, women were writing to us from all different cities in India saying that, don't stay in just Delhi and Mumbai, come to Indore, come here, come there, do this in a hybrid way so it's more accessible. And I think from our essential approach is, it's not like, again, 30,000 foot view. It's very actionable takeaways. So, by professionals for professionals. So we probably will tap you in at some point, Puneet, to also do a chat for us. But so, of course, we want allies and mentors who are men as well, but primarily for women who can then leverage that kind of solidarity and network, and also upskill to gain in confidence, and then also, find ways to stay in the workforce. So yeah, fingers crossed. It's very early days yet, but still.
Got it. So just curious to know, Amrita, in terms of like throughout the journey, a lot of parts where you have helped others, both in terms of, like you said, something that made you start Health Collective, then being a listener or just empathizing with people who reach out to you through all of this exposure, or supporting women. Like, how have you coped up with all of, because I'm sure you also would have gone through the ups and downs as well of the journey of both entrepreneur as well as working in organizations. And I think journalism, for that matter, is not very easy, if you ask me as well. I know some friends who are journalists. How do you cope up with, I think, all of that journey? Like, are there times when you feel like I want to shut myself down and like just have my time?
Yeah, 100%. I think, and that's again such an important question, and thank you for asking that. I think that what we end up seeing of each other's lives tends to be only, if you're in the limelight or your social media is so curated that, obviously people don't have time to share all of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. So I have 2, I think, episodes that were really satisfying for me. One of them was actually with the Health Collective, when we decided to do this Mindscape series of books with Simon & Schuster. So this first book launched, Real Stories of Dealing with Depression. We had more than 150 people come to IIC New Delhi for that launch. It was wonderful, but I hit a wall. And after that, I was just wiped out for weeks, and I couldn't understand why, until I realized that, there's obviously going to be something that you need to create as a buffer around yourself if you're constantly reading stories or listening to people or, who are talking about very serious things. So I don't have training as a therapist. I don't actually do therapy sessions, but, there's something that you need to learn, even as journalists, without losing sort of your empathy or your humanity, but you do need to learn when to cut off to some extent, so I did speak to a few of the sort of friends who are experts who also realized they're like, you are pushing yourself a little too hard. But I don't think I learned that lesson, because the next year, as the pandemic was hitting, we had a couple of, this young mental health book was going to come out. So it came out during the pandemic, and we had the Age of Anxiety book again, the publisher was very excited to have it out during the pandemic because it's so relevant. But it took a toll. I think, my friends and family, especially my partner, my mom, would tell me, I mean, not in a sort of lecture way, but they just be like, you're not here. Like, we can't even have a conversation. You're very checked out and it's great. You're doing all these things, but where is the time for yourself? Like, I couldn't switch off, so I'd be working through the week on office work and then the weekend on the Health Collective. And then I just kept going and going and going. So I really had to take stock, because at some point, I think if you don't do it for yourself, your mind and body will do it for you. So for some of us, for example, if we're workaholics, you will find you're falling sick and that's the only time you take time off work. It's not a healthy balance. So for me, I've realized that as much as I like to preach work-life balance, I need to learn how to be that person also for myself. And I wish as a journalist that, we had thought more about mental health. I think finally I'm seeing a lot of workshops. I've done a few with different organizations, at least moderated a few for journalists and mental health, because journalists, people who work in trust and safety, folks are seeing the worst side of things also, and I think having that kind of, again, preventive shield of sorts, if you will, is really critical, because it's hard not to then take that seriously. One of the journalists who was, covering COVID-19 said that the guilt every day that they had to go, of course, this is an important job because you're letting the world know, but the guilt of going out and covering this pandemic when you think you might be infecting your, your parents or your loved ones, it was too much. So we all need a good support system, but we also all need that kind of me time that, we talk about, like a vent. Like, what do you do that's not just for productivity or for social media or whatever? What do you do for yourself? So I think that's been important.
Maybe just one question on the media side again, a little bit. Like, I'm not sure if you also heard about one of the US schools actually has lodged a case against a lawsuit against YouTube, TikTok. I think yesterday read it in the news, right? In terms of alleging that it's causing a lot of addiction, and it's a known, even though they know it, they purposefully designed these platforms for being addictive, right? So with obviously all of us understand technology and everything has two sides of it, right? And it's as good as we use it, but in your experience, especially with media and social media as one of those segments, like, how do we, like, what are certain things and ways to make sure we leverage it for the best and try to avoid the worst side of it? Because I'm sure you told about following the right people, but how do we know that? And especially, let's say, you're very active on LinkedIn as well now, if you look at it. And that's one, I think, platform most of us here, being working professionals, are, I think, very active on, especially in the last 2 to 3 years. Like, how do we look at LinkedIn as a platform and make sure we are using it for the best use that it's intended to?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'm actually quite new to be back on LinkedIn. So I should probably take tips from all of you. But I think that I found it a little bit less hectic. Like, I think it is definitely a platform I'm getting used to. It feels a little bit more corporate, of course, than the other ones. But I'll tell you one thing. We had this, this book, Age of Anxiety. I used a column that Kamna, my co-author, had written for Health Collective, because it was it's precisely about what to do if the news is triggering your anxiety. So in the context, and here if we see news as not just the national news media or international media, but social media, because you're right, that is such an important source now. I don't know how many people watch. It's worth doing a survey. Who's watching, news programming on TV versus getting your clip, snippets on social, versus hearing from your favorite influencers who kind of tell you what's happening anyway. And I think she had a series of tips, which I'm happy to share with your audience after this. I'll send you the link. It was actually one of those things where you have to really think about. There is no compulsion, like, you're not getting a prize, like, it's not school anymore. You're not getting a prize for being up to date on every terrible thing that's happening in the world. It's good. I really, of course, as a former journalist, I want to know everything that's happening. But there comes a point when I'm like, I might be tired of hearing about, and this happened in the pandemic. We know that people started saying, like, oh, I don't want bad news anymore, So I think it's curating who we get our news from, which is very important. And I think if, for those of your audience who have children or people who are just getting on social, it's really critical to remember that, we have to inculcate that attitude, be very mindful of, frankly, as a journalist, you're kind of told most everyone has an agenda. If a source is giving you a story, there's an agenda, find out what the agenda is. Doesn't mean you don't do the story. It means that you have some understanding. I think that's a good lens also when you're looking, consuming media. But with social media, it makes me very uncomfortable. I know these studies that, they've been made more addictive, different forms of social media by design. The whole likes, that kind of, that rewards you in your, whatever, prefrontal cortex or whichever part of your brain that's getting rewards. it is very disturbing. So in this column, coming back to what Kamna was saying, I think it was important to know when you switch off. Like, you have to remember you're in control. Otherwise, social media is running your life. This is a similar argument that they're saying about AI, right? I mean, at some point, if we're going to depend so much and ask AI to write our essays, ask AI what's the best, it'll do it. But then who's calling the shots in the end? So I think for all of us, and all of us are not in the news media, all of us are not in journalism. So maybe all of us don't need to know minute by minute what's happening in the world, right? So maybe control when you get your, how you get your news, where you get your news. And the best feature probably of your smartphone is keeping track of how much time you're spending, that screen time. I think for some of us, like maybe because we have to create our brands and because we do have to network, it becomes a critical part, like you're saying about LinkedIn. But LinkedIn can be used in a way also, right? You don't have to spend the whole day refreshing your feed. You can say, I'm going to do half an hour at this time and 1 hour in the evening. And the last tip that I was told was, first thing in the morning, don't be looking at your social media. Don't be scrolling through your feed. I know it feels like a lot more work, Puneet. I know it feels like a lot more work for us to be like, oh my God, now I have to think about who am I getting my news. But when you realize, this thing of how much of an impact that has on your mood, you're instantly realizing how much that attention economy is grabbing from you. Like, it's not, I don't think we know still today, even those long-term effects that they keep talking about. It's going to take another 5-10 years before people even realize. So it's best for us to try and control, put some measures in place, and take that extra effort. And I think, you can also Google these things. People have so many lists of their own, like 5 news sites I follow, or, whatever. Like, so, but basically curate that experience for yourself.
Got it. While we move forward to a couple of other points, maybe I'll just ask the audience as well. If you have any questions, maybe you could also type it here. We have also collated some from the other platforms as well, and we'll get into the Q&A very soon. So you can type it in the chat box, people who are listening here, and we can take it up as well. So I think one of the questions that came in, and maybe I'll take those couple of them before I think we also start getting live questions. See, one of the things is in Twitter, you have played a very senior role as well, like as a women leader. Like, what are some things that you faced as well during those roles?
Okay, thank you for that question, whoever shared that. For me, it took me a long time to realize that I am also battling major imposter syndrome, which is also ironic because even till today, when we're talking about achievements, it's very hard to think, okay, wait, I have things I can share, So I've done a few of these, management programs, and there was one with the Aspen India Fellowship, and it's taken me a long, so the fact that I'm sitting and talking to you so comfortably now, almost comfortably now, is a big, it's been a journey. So because I had switched careers, it took me a long time to understand what are the new, these goalposts are suddenly shifting, right? I've gone from doing shows. I know what a good show looks like. I know what a good story looks like. I know what a good interview feels like. I did a little bit of consulting for about a year and a half, but again, in my kind of comfort zone. And then I got this Twitter job, first as a 6-month contract, and then it got extended. It really helped me that my manager, who was in Australia at the time, was a former journalist. So he had to at one point tell me, forget bylines, forget that, satisfaction you get that, oh, I've done this and now I can see the impact. He said, this is a marathon. The work that you do here, you're not going to show results immediately. And it's absolutely true. So part of the job I had was to, negotiate revenue deals with content publishers, which was so far from my comfort zone that it took me a long time to get used to. The trick, I think, is finding the right allies, people who will build you up, people you can learn from, and not being afraid to say, I don't know. And that way, being a journalist helped me because, as a journalist, you're constantly asking questions. So you don't feel like someone's judging you for being stupid, because I know a lot of us we like to hold back because we don't want to be judged. But that was something I was able to take forward. I had to be really honest with some of these content publishers I had also worked with as on the editorial side. So, I had to play that dual role of okay, well, now we're talking about revenue and numbers and stuff. And they would know it's my first month or second month on the job because it's such a small ecosystem. So it was tough. I don't think it was easy. And I think it took me, I was there 5.5 years, easily 3 years and several deals before I felt like, oh, I should own this narrative now. Because, especially when you do these mid-career sort of transitions, I think it's very hard to feel confident and comfortable, it takes a while before you're like, okay, wait, I got this,
Got it. But you spoke about building allies as well as one big part of a support system, right? Especially for women to get inspired as well as to get guidance as well from are there certain forums, ways, how should one go about it?
Yes, well, very soon TapIn, my friends. TapIn will be your staunchest ally. That is one. I think, I hope those of you who are listening to this also have the good luck that I've had, because when I joined Twitter, I went on this official trip the week before I joined Twitter, and I met this lovely colleague, Jennifer Hollett from Canada. And she told me something about allies, and she was a former journalist. And interestingly, she's gone back to now being a journalist. She heads the digital media outfit, the Walrus in Canada. And I told her this recently. I said, it really helped me that you actually said in so many words, working in a global matrix organization, you need to build allies. And at that point, I was like, okay, I don't know what the hell she's talking about, but okay, I'll smile and be like, yes, sure. But nobody really spells it out for you. So I think what I have found helpful, and then also we know this from sort of social network theory and things like that, like it's not social ties theory, sorry. It's not that you can just go into a network and build relationships. Your strongest networks come out when you're finding similar interests, right? So even in an organization, it doesn't matter whether you're in the media, whether you're in social media, whether you're in tech, wherever you are, even in your own office or maybe your alliance of organizations, you will find that there are common interests. We have, I know a couple of my colleagues have this like very active football WhatsApp club. I'm not a part of that club, but I know that helps them, right? Because it's venting, it's not directly linked to your work. People are not worried about, but they get that space to chat, make alliances. When the layoffs happened, that kind of group was very helpful for each other because they could all of a sudden give each other leads quickly and stuff like that. I think women need a little bit more sometimes of a nudge and a push, because I've heard, of course, that, not everyone is comfortable going out, let's say, for drinks after work, or your day is exhausting. You have to take care of your kids, all of those things. Even if you don't have kids, I don't have kids, but it's not that easy to fit in socializing and networking. But you can do it on the job. You can find organizations that help you do it. Like I said, I hope TapIn becomes a friendly organization where we have different tracks for different industries. But none of these will work if you don't feel, I think for a lot of women, we don't feel that our careers come first, maybe. I'm not talking about myself here. I feel like I've always been invested in my career, but that doesn't mean I take myself seriously in my career. And I think for a lot of people who've been to business school, automatically they know how to take themselves seriously in a career, So we need to unlearn a lot of things to feel comfortable saying, hey, the simplest thing somebody told me was reach out to your network. We are all here to help. But if you don't tell us how, we don't know how to help you. So you already have, everyone listening here has some network, has some support system. So you need to know who you can reach out to. How do you make the ask? Whatever your ask is, it could be that, you're thinking of talking to your manager for promotion, like I said, or you need to take a break, or you need to switch careers. You're very confused. If you reached out to someone, I find it very, very unusual that people say no. They might not say I have time tomorrow, but they usually will tell you, okay, I'll come. They'll come back with something more constructive. So even if it takes women some unlearning, some unconditioning, you should figure out a way to tap your network. And just one practical piece of advice: sometimes it's not your own direct team, because of course you'll be in competition with your own direct team. It makes sense that it's not your own, direct team. Probably look for another, office buddy or somebody in that system. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Definitely, I think that does. I think give some. So maybe just one other question. I think it's more around the books that you have written. So you have been an author to multiple books: Broken News, CV's Not, and Real Stories of Dealing with Depression. Like, what time went into the research, and how did you decide to write a book on that?
That is such a good question. I love this question, but it's a very long answer, so I will try and keep it short. I think. So as I said, I always wanted to be. Before I wanted to be a writer, I was a reader. I think that with Broken News, which was my first novel, I used to have a blog also, actually, which is how this publisher noticed. And I'd gone to one of the very early avatars of the Jaipur Lit Fest. And this publisher met me there and said, we love your blog. We'd love to commission a book. And they had something very dramatic in mind about the news business. And I was like, okay, I don't want to do that, but let me try and work on something else. And that, I think I took a couple of years. I had given myself this very artificial deadline of before I'm 30, I want to be published. So please do not do that to yourselves. But it was a very, I think, easy book. It was very conversational, a lot of drama set in and around the newsroom. And it was basically about relationships and, the sort of pressure and adrenaline. So that probably took me the least amount of time to write. It was really fun to launch. But I wasn't really sure that I was still a writer. Like, I think it takes some time to sink in, because everyone says, especially for journalists, you have one book in you. So I was like, Chalo, that might have been my one book, But then after that, I started working on a much more complicated book. The CBS Not is actually about a group of young people who are, again, dealing with a lot of dysfunction, alcohol addiction, death they become a sort of cult. And then it takes a very, very interesting but dark turn. So when I started that, I actually thought was writing a book of short stories. And at that point I had an agent and I mailed her and said, look at these fantastic short stories I've written and they all link together. And she's like, darling, go back and do your work. It's actually a novel. There's a lot of work left. So that took several years, and then I think with the mental health books, because it's non-fiction, in a way I feel more confident. And of course, after the Sidious Knot came out, I was like, okay, now I'm a writer because there are 2 books. But with the non-fiction series, I actually went to Simon & Schuster and said, there's something here, like the Health Collective, we're getting so many stories. There has to be a way for us to make this kind of easier, like I was saying, conversational mental health easier. And they commissioned the 3 books in the Mindscape series. And that took a lot of, it's been probably 5-6 years in the process, but I had amazing collaborators, like I said, the psychologist, Kamna Chibber, Meera Haran Alva, and Arpita Anand. And the final book was on suicide prevention. That was with 2 psychiatrists. That was the hardest one, to be honest with you. It was right coming out of the pandemic, very, very difficult topics, talking to people who'd gone through the worst, so that was the hardest. But, for anyone who's interested in writing, I just feel like if you're a reader, that's the best first step. I know it's the most basic piece of advice, but I do think we all have stories in us. And I think that there's nothing to stop you nowadays. It's so much easier to get your audience also sorted. So anyone who's interested, don't worry about how much time it will take. Just do a good job and tell the best story you can tell,
How do you write a book? Like I tell you, for example, see, definitely there are stories worth telling, but
yeah,
somehow like a person like me who would generally be very conscious about the number of words in which I speak or write, I think a book looks like a marathon, right? Like I can write a small post or a short 2-liner or a 1-pager, but then a book is like too long. Like how do you kind of keep yourself motivated throughout the journey?
I think, so Puneet, it depends on the story. So if you think, you're absolutely right. When you look at the finished product, like I sometimes have a disconnect. I'm like, wow, like look at that finished product versus, the behind the scenes pain that went through. But if you think about it as like, okay, look, I have this big picture thing I want to tell. If it's fiction, it's very different. If it's fiction, some people start with a character, right? All of a sudden a character comes to them and then they're like, I have to tell that story through the character. Some people have the plot. But from what you just said about the word count, I wouldn't worry about that so much, because if you're able to write a blog post, right? And you think about writing a blog post every week for 6-7 months, don't beat yourself up if you don't do it, but try and give yourself a schedule. Most of us are juggling other things because it's not that easy to make a living as a writer anyway, right? So it's probably on the weekend. Maybe it's a Saturday morning that you're like, okay, chalo, I'll take 3 hours, but I'll write this one blog post. That's 400 words. That's 500 words. It could be 1,000 words if you're having a great, outflow. If you don't sit and criticize yourself and edit every blog post that you write, but you finish that 6 months, you will be amazed because, again, then you take a few weeks off and then you go and you start editing, and you'll find that in that time you've actually written whatever that maths adds up to. So I think the best thing for these things is don't stare at a blank page. And honestly, some people find it much easier just to take out a notebook and write. And I find that sometimes if you're sitting in a cafe, you're waiting for someone, you hear so many interesting conversations around you, right? Like we just never have the time to sit and process. So take a little notebook with you, jot things down. If you feel, again, it's not for everyone. So it's not like everyone has to write something, but I think what's happened with the way we live our lives now is there's so much emphasis on productivity that you don't even know that sometimes this writing is very cathartic for you. Like it's not it might be something you're like, okay, it's a fun project, may get published, may not get published, might be something fun for my followers to see, but don't be scared of the word count, because like you said, and even if it's like a 2-line, 1-paragraph, short stories are like super crisp and short, right? So it's not really quality over quantity, I would say.
But what do you enjoy more? Like, do you enjoy writing books or do you enjoy hosting? Because you have done a lot of both as well. I
don't know. Actually, it's a tricky one. I love writing. I hate editing. And unfortunately, that's a very, very, writing is like this really weird, like, it can, I think it can be when it's done well. It's like, for me, it's like reading. Like, I think nothing will ever match that kind of solitude. And if you do it right, you feel like you're connected to something deeper, very profound. But I love hosting and meeting people. So I think what I missed the most of my job was doing interviews, because, I feel like I learned so much. I think most of us used to go into journalism to change the world. And I found that it is amazing when that switch happens and you realize it's changed you, because you've just met so many people outside of your own sort of silo. So I don't know which one I'd pick, actually. Maybe I'd meet them and then I'd write about them. So then it'll be doing both. Yeah.
So I think one last question we'll pick maybe. Hi, Amrita, very inspiring to hear from you. You mentioned about mental health first aid. Very curious to hear about this a bit more. So maybe if you could just take us through, I think during Twitter, you mentioned about mental health first aid.
Yes. So we had actually this program, and you get them in India also, where I'm sure Yodos also has actually facilities for this. These are usually very short courses that teach you how to be an empathetic listener. So Puneet can jump in and correct me when I'm wrong, but but we learned the basics about like mental health. Like for example, the fact that we all have mental health. I was doing this interview with a leading psychiatrist for the Health Collective. So 6-7 years ago. And even I had not realized that actually we all have mental health. When we talk about mental illness, we sometimes confuse it with mental health, and then there becomes this whole, but the fact that everyone has mental health, we can all protect our mental health. What are some preventive things to get better, promote better mental health? And usually these can be in the context of the workplace. So even things like mental health hygiene, right? Like how do you take care of so one of the questions Puneet asked was, when I'm doing all of these books and stories, and how am I taking care of my mental health, right? So you learn these things. For me, the most important really was that thing of learning empathetic listening, because it's not something you're taught otherwise, So Puneet, I think you can add to that, or maybe you can put a link,
Sure.
One of you can put a link to where you can do this. That'll be great.
Sure. I think for us, we call it psychological first aid. And for us, psychological first aid more is, let's say, if I were to draw a parallel, think of it as like how we all know first aid in terms of physical health. Let's say if someone gets a cut or a bruise, I know how to clean that wound and apply, let's say, a band-aid or something. Very similar to that, we have something called psychological first aid, where you have basic skills that you could have. Because see, I'll tell you honestly, even for me, before we got into those who started this, even I would be scared if someone in front of me says, I want to harm myself or I want to take my life. Right? So this kind of somewhere gives you those basic skill sets that helps an individual support others and understand someone more, like not become a counselor. Obviously, that's I think stretching too much, because see, even if you get cut, you know when to distinguish between where you can help versus when you take them to the hospital. Very similar to that, a psychological first aid helps you support someone psychologically and also draw a line on how do you also tell someone in terms of how to handle this and how to refer them for professional help.
Yeah. So and in the context of a company, like so with Twitter, they would tell us specifically, you can talk about this, let them know you're not a counselor, let them know that mental health is covered by your insurance and this is who they can reach out to, stuff like that. So it's definitely worth looking into if you're interested, whoever asked that question. Thank you. It's a good one. So
we have, I think from Pavitra, we have a question here. Could you explain something about depression which you have witnessed?
Oh my, that's a really loaded last question, I think probably. I will tell you from the stories I have been shared, I'm quite privileged that people share with me quite openly, is that it maybe more broadly, not just depression, but certainly depression does it. It apparently feels like you can't trust your brain anymore, right? Because you're going into this very dark place where you feel like you're unlovable, you're unloved, nobody cares about you, you're alone. And it's a big, big thing to seek out help. It's very hard to do if you don't have support, of course, but even with support, it's very hard to do because people don't understand what you're going through, right? And partly that's because we use these terms now so loosely. Like I'm having a bad day, I'll be like, bro, I'm depressed, like I have the blues. And then somebody will say, go out and get some exercise and shake it off. And it worked for me, why didn't it work for you? But depression as a disorder can be so destabilizing, I've heard. And even people who have shared with us how they've gotten better, because of course you can get better. There is a journey to healing. That's what the psychologists and psychiatrists are there for. It helps them to have a support group, right? Other people who've gone through it. Because it's not like you reach the final, line and you're done. Unfortunately, it is a lifelong journey. And, for people who love you, I'm sure, Puneet, you've seen this as well. For people who care about somebody who has depression, you need a lot of patience. You need to take care of yourself. You need to take time outs and understand that there will be days when you're frustrated, and that's okay. You just don't take it out on the other person, but it's okay. And I think the more we have these kind of difficult conversations, but make them easier for each other, the less it feels then like your brain is telling you that you're alone, nobody cares about you, nobody else knows what you're going through. We're all unique, but many of our problems are very, very, somebody else is going through the same thing, So yeah, I think that there's also that famous quote by Stephen Fry to the British comedian, who said that sometimes it's raining out and you just need an umbrella, and depression can feel like that. If you have the right toolkit, support system, you can weather that storm. But I know it's very hard to take that first step to ask for help, but just know that you're not alone, whoever's dealing with something like this.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that, Amrita. I'm sure, I think it does, I think it takes a lot of, I think, patience and perseverance, and like you said, your personal journey, and connect to, I think, get behind this with full force and support others. So I think thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Can I add one last thing? Sorry, we're out of time.
Sure.
But one more thing is, when we did that book on depression, the real stories of dealing with depression, one of the most amazing comments I got was from someone who said, the fact that you have a journalist, you have a civil servant, you have a teacher, you have an academic, and we had somebody else, I'm forgetting, sorry, I think it was a cartoonist, but basically, depression doesn't know a gender, it doesn't know a job, there is no such thing as it's not going to affect us. So at this point, just given the statistics, everyone listening to this, there's probably somebody you know and love who's dealing with something like this, or somebody in your office or in your team or in your family. So I think Puneet, the least we can do is share that. It does not discriminate, unfortunately, right? It affects so many people that even caring enough to listen to this conversation or try and find out more is actually a huge step, a huge help.
Right. Definitely. I think, because I also remember, I think in our journey as well, I think it is difficult to, I think, go through those times, and also a lot of times the caregiver stress and how do you connect to them. I think those are things to be taken care of as a support system as well.
Yeah.
So I think, thank you so much. I think we are towards the end of this episode. So thank you so much, Amrita, for the time that you have spent and have taken out for us. I'm sure there's a lot of things we can learn from you. And also, like you said, I think TapIn is something which has just started, and through that, a lot of women upliftment and rights are being taken care of. And like you rightly said, I think building that ally is something very important as well. And I'm sure maybe TapIn could be one such ally that people could reach out to and grow further in the journey. But thank you so much, Amrita, for taking the time out and sharing your own personal journey, as well as, I think, certain things you have observed and how you're helping others. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting this. I hope it went well. I hope you're not nervous now, because clearly it was a very nicely done conversation. I appreciate it. And thanks everyone for the questions as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amrita, for your time. Thank you everyone for joining.